today's World Insight, Chinese and EU leaders meet virtually. Can they come to agreements on the Ukraine crisis and trade? And we speak to the newly appointed Chinese ambassador to Indonesia, Kang. What can he tell us about the prospects of China-Indonesia ties?
Developing countries should unite on all those international or multilateral fora.
Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello, I'm Tian Wei, and welcome to World Insight. We begin with a look at the summit between Chinese and EU leaders. Chinese President Xi Jinping met with the European Council President and the European Commission President via video link on Friday during the 23rd China-EU leaders meeting. This is the first China-EU summit since 2020 and comes amid conflicts between Russia and Ukraine. President Xi from China said that under the current circumstances, China and the EU should increase communication to secure global peace and development and play a stabilizing role in a turbulent world. He also stressed that China-EU cooperation has achieved new results amid difficulties. Earlier today, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang held an online meeting with both top EU leaders as well. Premier Li from China said that China supports a peaceful resolution to the Ukraine crisis and is willing to play a constructive role to promote peace talks. China and the EU also agreed on strengthening dialogue, deepening cooperation, and upholding multilateralism. More on China-EU summit. Joining us in Rome, Michele Gallacci, the former Undersecretary of the Italian Ministry of Economic Development. Good to see you, sir. Long time no see. And also in Beijing, with me in the studio, Professor Wang Yiwei, Jean Monnet Chair Professor and Director of the Center for EU Studies at Renmin University of China. Gentlemen, what a pleasure to have both of you reunited in this program. Finally, we could talk about Europe. But of course, this is with the backdrop of Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, Professor Wang, tell me more about how do you see the readout coming from the Chinese side in any way indicate that the two sides, China and EU, might be coming closer with one another?
I think quite close on the successful summit because they go beyond the three hot pot issues. Firstly, not hijacked by the Ukraine crisis. Look at the big picture, how solve the problem, not just blame each other. Secondly, not hijacked by the single member state of the European Union, like Luxembourg. And thirdly, not hijacked by the single issue like human rights, Xinjiang issue, and sanctions, anti-sanctions. So looking forward of the future cooperation and the dynamic resilience of the trade issue and also human rights dialogue separately and political dialogue, human people-to-people dialogue as well.
So you are saying that the two sides, at least during this meeting, has managed to focus on the big issues as a whole, rather than only focusing on one or two, so that it is a comprehensive talk that they're having. Professor Gallacci, is that your thinking?
Slightly different. You are right. Way they did talk about many things, and when you talk about many things, it's easier to agree because maybe one side agree on half of them, and the other side agree on half of the other half, which is much better than just discuss one topic, which would be divisive. I did, however, because I've also spoken to some people just a few minutes ago, and there was an intense pressure on the EU side to actually bring the human rights, the usual issues. Xinjiang and so on up to the center of the discussion, and also, but this is usual, so I'm not too worried about that. The President von der Leyen has, in a way, insisted that China should take active action to help solve the crisis between Russia and Ukraine, to the point that the EU, not quite threatened, but let's say strongly invited China not to step in the middle between the sanctions that the EU has placed on Russia. In other words, I understand, I translated, China should limit purchases of gas and oil from Russia, because in the EU side, this would be seen as infringing or making the sanctions weaker. So quite a strong invitation that, you're Chinese. China does not really like to be told by other countries what they should do. So I think there is a little bit of communication and cultural gap that still needs to be solved.
Yeah.
And that's what we try to do.
I can tell, Mr. Geraci, you are putting it in a very diplomatic way already. Of course, there are differences, and that's why talks and discussions are extremely crucial, particularly now. Professor Wang, on the Russia-Ukraine issue, now we see Europe earlier at the very beginning of the conflict, very emotional, of course, until today. Given the historical ties, given the direct impact the European continent is likely to have as a result. But on the other hand, it is much a sobering thinking right now because some have been suggesting about the self-inflicted economic difficulties as a result of sanctions against Russia. There's also dependency on Russia and the EU countries together over the decades. So now, Professor Wang, how do you see the complex emotions, shall we say, and also thinking that the European countries have from China's perspective?
After 1 month, even more of the war and the sanctions, and the Europeans felt fatigue about that. They should get out from this worst scenario. They try to understand the Chinese position, not too much emotionally, that combine China and Russia. China and Russia, actually, the new type of power relations is not just an ally, it's, they have the bottom line that's based on the UN that respect the sovereignty of territory. I think that's firstly. Secondly,
I just want to make sure what you're saying, they are not allies. That's what you're trying to say, right?
Yes.
Mr. Wang, okay, go ahead.
Secondly, China's foreign policy is very independent, not just either join the Western bloc with the sanctions to Russia or support Russia. These are two. Either or scenario is not the case.
Yeah.
China is always midway to independently to deal with both Russia and the European Union. So
The
that's very important.
nuances are very important, and that is why talks are of great significance. It's not just China, India as well. For example, the economic and trade ties India with Russia, the energy ties, and also the history ties, the geopolitical ties. So in that regard, China is not a single case standing out, but rather indicating the complex situation. Having said that, though, Mr. Geraci, it is a Russia-Ukraine issue, but not necessarily just about that, because the issue is big only because it's having rippling effect in so many different areas. So now, Professor Geraci, do you see now Europe is becoming more sober in terms of the solutions?
A little bit. There is indeed some emotions because, of course, when we see people dying on the street, emotions dominate. Of course, now we have a debate in Italy and Europe about sanctions, yes or no. And I have a different view than what you may hear. I believe that these economic sanctions are not really working to the goal of stopping the war. And these are sanctions that hurt Europe more than it hurts Russia. And we are seeing these day by day developing. And so we in Europe start to think that maybe we need to find alternative ways. And this is now when China comes into play. Because while at the beginning people were insisting for China to take an active role to condemn, while China has rightly kept the neutrality, now this neutrality can come to help as a mediator. Because only if you are neutral, you can mediate. So our sanctions are not so effective. And again, you would hear different things. That's not true. We did the analysis. We have to rely on the Russian gas. We cannot do without it. And therefore, in electoral democracy, when the economy starts to suffer, the political consensus for insisting on sanctions that hurt low-end, low-income people who see gas prices, electricity prices going up diminishes. And so I think now it's the time for a kind, maybe invitation for China, who has a good relationship, like we heard, with both parties, to step in also because China trades 50 billion with Russia, 10 billion with Ukraine, import of agricultural commodities. So it is in China's interest to make sure that everything stabilizes,
It
because
is.
China cares about economic prosperity.
It is an evolving situation, Professor Geraci, as you just put it. And also you see the shuttling diplomacy involving China, India, and some of the other players as well, who have been talking to Russia. Of course, Washington has no access to Russia at this moment almost, and therefore you cannot depend on that. So having said that, though, what about the other important issues on China-EU's agenda? You know, the comprehensive trade deal on investment has been very much under discussion for years, under political ups and downs over the past few years. Now, Professor Wang, how far are we now still from there?
I think the European Union now understands more than before after this conflict in Ukraine, the importance of China and EU relations, particularly in the trade investment. Firstly, last year, EU back to be #1 trade partner for China. Actually, in the past 16 years before, only replaced by ASEAN, because of COVID-19. So growing very rapidly, still very dynamic and resilient. And for European Union, they suffered with the side effect of the sanctions to Russia. They need to go beyond of that. So need also the energy transformation, economic recession to deal with that, and they need China's cooperation. I think very important. I think also for China to boom the economy and to also for the climate change deal, or overcome the hot issues in the world.
Professor Geraci, China's economic size now almost in parallel with that of the EU. Of course, this does not necessarily mean a dramatic transformation, but this could mean a different way of consultation and interaction with one another. Now, Professor Geraci, under these circumstances, how do you see this bilateral investment treaty and also other agreements and deals that should long be reached?
I think the investment agreement, you are right, Tianwei, is in the interest of both. It has, however, met some political obstacles a year and a half ago, and so it has a little bit been parked. Now, this does not mean that the two blocs do not trade or do not invest in each other. The CAI was offering a framework, a protection, some kind of a reference to which companies could refer to in case of a problem. A little bit like the MOU on the Belt and Road that Italy happily did when I was in the government, to offer companies a umbrella under which they can cooperate, and also to stimulate them to do business with each other. So the fact that the CIA is not being approved and signed yet does not worry me too much, because companies do see the opportunities. I do see that, especially when we have a weak economic situation in Europe,
right.
European company, German company, French company, Italian company do look at the Chinese market with a strong interest. So the reality, I think, now is almost more important than the formality of the agreement.
Mr. Geraci, Wang Yiwei, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Appreciate it. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program today. We speak to exclusively the newly appointed Chinese ambassador to Indonesia, Kang. What can he tell us about the prospect of China-Indonesia ties? Next. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi met with his Indonesian counterpart, Retno Marsudi, in Anhui this Thursday. Noting their importance on the world scene as large developing countries, the two sides vowed to promote the ASEAN outlook in the Indo-Pacific. Meanwhile, China will strengthen cooperation with Indonesia in the G20. China and Indonesia have many achievements in diverse fields of cooperation. China has become Indonesia's largest trading partner, with their bilateral trade rising by 54% in the past year. The Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail line is a landmark BRI project symbolizing China-Indonesia cooperation. With all expectations on China-Indonesia relations and beyond, I talked to Kang, the newly appointed Chinese ambassador to Indonesia. Let's take a look at this exclusive. Ambassador Kang, what a pleasure.
Good to see you again, Tianwei.
Good to see you. And you are already in Indonesia for about a month. Tell me more about how do you see, as the ambassador to Indonesia from China, the increased interactions between the two sides?
You know that even in the context of COVID-19, we had a very frequent, very close interaction between our two sides. President Xi Jinping and President Jokowi actually had around 6 telephone conversations. And even just in the first quarter of this year, they had 2 very constructive telephone conversations. And you know that actually the Indonesia Foreign Minister, Retno Marsudi, just accomplished a very successful visit to China and very successful talks with State Councilor Wang Yi. They reached a lot of common agreements, a lot of consensus on issues not only related to our bilateral relations, such as, for example, we should strengthen our bilateral trade, investment, cooperation. We should make more comparison on our notes on regional issues and those important topical issues on international arena.
I understand you were earlier on an inspection tour to the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway. Now, that has been a railway both presidents have been talking about and talking about implementation as well. What have you found out there?
You're absolutely right. That's a very important project. And that's a joint venture, actually featured the nature of our bilateral cooperation. I can tell you that almost in all the telephone conversations, the contacts between our two presidents, almost every time, both of them will talk about that. And both of them have already instructed us that this project should be accomplished on schedule. So that's why, you know, that after quarantine, I immediately went out to jointly with the coordinating minister from the Indonesia government, Luhut, to have a joint inspection on site. To be honest, that happened in the context of COVID-19. And this pandemic did cause some problems and difficulties for the construction, some inconvenience. But to my pleasure, both sides, I mean the working teams on both sides, they are committed to overcome all those difficulties and try to accomplish the project. You know that this project is important not only for Indonesia, but also for this bilateral relationship, and also actually for China's initiative of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's important for Indonesia people because that's one of the priorities of the government led by President Jokowi, actually to accelerate the development of the infrastructure in Indonesia and to make people's livelihood much better off. So you know that actually this railway is constructed in the most densely populated area in Indonesia. Definitely, almost everybody agrees that that will be very conducive to the business, to people's flow around this area. That's also very important for the China-Indonesia bilateral relationship because that's a very, very important example and sample, actually, for how China and Indonesia, as two major emerging economies, could work together to carry out those mutually beneficial projects. And as I told you, I personally understand that that could also be a very good example of how the Belt and the Road Initiative could be presented as an international public good offered by the Chinese government, how that could be conducive to make people's life, make the development of those countries alongside the Belt and Road to be more and more accommodative actually to the needs of the people along this line.
To really serve the people, as we say in China, in a way.
Definitely. You know that when I went to visit those construction sites, I learned that actually if the project is accomplished on schedule, according to the existing schedule, actually, that will create more than 5,000 jobs alongside these only 142 some kilometers.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
It is very important to bring people hope. You know, it's a project of hope in a way. that through hard work, even during the most challenging pandemic time, things can be done. China and Indonesia are two of the largest developing countries, and they are particularly important within the G20 concept. So how are the largest developing countries are going to make united voices heard to the international community at a time when we are seeing so many changes, wars, pandemic, not to mention other kinds of geopolitics?
China and Indonesia were both important major emerging economies, major developing countries, were also very important Asian countries. So you know that we have a lot of common interests. And we also have a lot of common grounds when it comes to regional issues and those topical issues on international arena. So it's very important, actually, to have the international agenda implemented that could accommodate the interests, not only China or Indonesia, but of the developing countries as a whole. So what's most important here, I strongly believe that all developing countries, including China and Indonesia, we should stick to those principles, those positions. That's already universally accepted by the world. That's already enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. For example, the very important principle of non-intervention into domestic affairs of other countries. It's true that it's just a matter of fact that maybe developing countries might have less leverage than some other countries. But when developing countries unite together and stand up firmly against intervention into domestic affairs of respective countries, whether it's Indonesia, whether it's China, whether it's other developing countries, then you have a strong power, you have a strong force. Secondly, we should stick to the principle of trying to accommodate the interests and try to cultivate the potential of a mutually beneficial cooperation. This is also very important among developed countries because you know that when China carries out those cooperation with other developing countries, one of the most important principles we commit ourselves to is there should be no additional political preconditions imposed on others. All developing countries knows what they really want, where they are, and what kind of ways of development most fit their own domestic situation. So we should stand up together firmly against any attempt to intervene into domestic affairs of others and should stand up firmly against any attempt to impose what others might want on us. We know what we want.
Ambassador Lu, though, people have been trying to characterize what is going on in the world today, particularly after the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Some suggest using a Chinese phrase, 礼崩乐坏, earlier principles agreed upon by all of the world are now collapsing or being challenged by powers. So how do you see, developing countries can still be able to hold on to the principles?
First, as I just mentioned, that actually we should let others know or demonstrate to the outside that there is a unity. There is a unity among all the developing countries. Secondly, I think developing countries should unite on all those international or multilateral fora, especially featured with developing countries, for example, like the ASEAN plus China, the BRICS plus something.
What about G20? There's a lot of debate about whether one member of the G20 should be kicked out of the G20 platform. There's also issues about whether to bring more political issues onto the G20 platform rather than economic issues, which this format was really about. So how do you see that? And where is China and Indonesia on this?
It's important for Indonesia to host the G20 summit this year. As I said, Indonesia is a very important economic, emerging economy. It's a very important Asian developing country. So a successful G20 this year is not only important for Indonesia, but also for Asia, for all the developing world. And on the specific issue you just mentioned, Indonesia government, Indonesia officials these days have made it very clear that G20 is an economic forum. It should be focused on the economic agenda, which is very imperative now for all the countries around the world, especially in the recovery from COVID-19. So actually the main theme for this year's summit, that's recover together, recover stronger. In spite of some of the noises, actually the Indonesian government has already made it very clear that they would stick to the main theme. They would stick to the basic nature of G20. And they believe that all members of G20 should be given equal treatment. On all those, China stands firmly with Indonesia.
I remember, if I remember right, at the very beginning of your journey to Indonesia, a journalist asked you, what part of the Indonesian culture would you enjoy the most? And what about Indonesian food? And you talk about your wife and you try to explore the culture there and talk to people. Tell me more about that part of your life.
Although I'm here for about 38 or 39 days, I still couldn't afford sufficient time to going out a lot. But definitely, you know that actually I'd love to. I strongly believe it's a privilege for diplomats posted abroad that they might have more chances than just a tourist or whatever, or a student, to have some in-depth knowledge and understanding of a specific country, especially a country like Indonesia, featured with the diversity of its culture, its tradition, and social life. So I'd love to, and so long as I could spend more time on that.
Looking forward to your further report about that front. Thank you so much, Ambassador Lu Kang from Indonesia. China's newly appointed ambassador to Indonesia, Lu Kang, in an exclusive interview. That's all we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of my team. Thanks for being with us, and bye for now.